Okay, so my talk is Linchpin, the long road to the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. And by the way, I'm going to ask our one member who is from the UK originally, whatever errors he sees, if he'll just let me know about them in private afterwards.
I'll get some masking.
Yeah, okay. Oh, yeah. Anyway, so what is a linchpin? A linchpin is a person or a thing vital to an enterprise or organization. And what I'm going to maintain today is that the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway was the linchpin of the aegis of development of commercial railway travel in the throughout the world, but starting in England. So the first thing I'm going to address is the advent of overland commercial travel in Great Britain. The forerunner of the first commercial railroad in the UK was a stagecoach operating over a fixed route, the first of which traveled from Edinburgh to Leith in 1610. These coaches ran on the first day of each month, took 10 days in the summer, 12 days in the winter. I question the 12 days in the winter. I would have thought maybe more like 14 or 21, depending what the winter was like. But anyway, unlike the American stagecoach, the first British versions were little more than covered wagons drawn by 4 horses. Travel on these early stagecoach services was brutal. There was little protection from the weather, especially for the second-class riders who had to travel on top. The ride was very rough, with accompanying soreness and motion sickness. Also, these services were subject to breakdowns as well as attacks by highwaymen. So a 2.0 version of commercial land travel in Great Britain was the flying coach. And the coach, you notice that these aren't Pegasus horses. They don't have wings. So it really didn't leave the ground. But what it did do was it operated about twice as fast as a regular stagecoach. And this was a limited stop, same day, not 10 or 12 days, stagecoach, which made its debut between Oxford and London in 1764. These coaches traveled at speeds of up to 8 miles per hour. So pretty much, may seem slow to us, but it definitely seemed like a flying coach, especially if you were riding in the back of it. While unpleasant by contemporary standards, stagecoaches were still a more comfortable way to travel as compared to riding in an ox cart or walking. Soon a series of stagecoach routes, using London as a hub, radiated out across Great Britain. So not only can we thank the British people for coming up with the first commercial railway, we can also thank them for the hub and spoke system. But we're going to digress a little bit and go into the evolution of steam power. Prior to the development of commercial land travel in Britain, and in a seemingly unrelated event, a Frenchman, Salomon de Coulx, had published an article in 1625 laying out the concept of a steam-driven pump. And there it is. You just boil the water and, the steam came out, and hopefully you get it to do something, while it was working that way. It was the development of this, as well as some of his later writings, specifically one referring to steam-driven transport, which landed him a spot in a French insane asylum. Edward Somerset, the second Marquis of Worcester, visited Salomon de Coulx in the asylum and returned to England enthusiastic with the idea of a steam engine. In 1663, using the barrel of a cannon, you have to look carefully at that diagram there to figure out where the cannon is, but you'll see it. It's almost like Where's Waldo? He used the barrel of a cannon, designed a water commanding engine. So isn't that cool? This engine's going to command the water to, get sucked up into it, to pump up water. This invention was quickly derided as at best a toy, and was then forgotten for several decades. In his will, the discouraged Marquis requested that a model of his engine be buried with him. 200 years later, in 1861, a scientific search, and this is right out of the history books, a scientific search was made of the then rehabilitated Marquis's coffin, but no model was discovered. So again, another thing Great Britain has given us is scientific grave robbing. Thomas Savery, a Cornish mining engineer, is credited with developing and patenting the first practical steam engine in 1698. Known as a steam pump, or a Savery engine, it was designed to pump wastewater out of mines. A decade after this, Thomas Newcomen improved on Savery's design in 1712 by using a piston to drive a pump that filled up with wastewater. Within the next decade, hundreds of Newcomen's pumps were in use throughout British mines. Somewhat mistakenly, James Watt has been called the father of the steam engine. As indicated by my previous slides, this was not quite the case. Watt and his business partner, Thomas Moulton, did, however, make a substantial and patented improvement to Newcomen's engine in 1765, thus paving the way for the eventual development of a steam carriage. If you look at this thing, it looks a little bit like an oil derrick. Back in France, Nicolas Joseph Cunon constructed the first steam-powered vehicle, entitled a Fermier de Vapeur, or steam carriage. A full-size version was introduced in 1770. The above prototype carried 4 passengers and moved at the record-breaking speed of 2.5 miles an hour. Unfortunately, it needed to have both its fire relit and its steam pressure restored every 15 minutes. So if you wanted to set something up and you could do your journey very slowly in 15 minutes, this was the vehicle for you. Anything over 15 minutes would probably quickly become tiresome. In addition, because of the large boiler you can see in front of the Cunard's vehicle there, because of the large boiler centered at the front, the steam carriage's weight was significantly unbalanced. I'm surprised those rear wheels weren't up in the air when they did this. I guess that's why they put humans on them. During a test drive, the contraption got away from its inventor and crashed into a wall in Paris, causing the first mechanical vehicle traffic accident. Eventually, the device was pronounced to be impractical, i.e. a menace, and was subsequently retired. I suspect the authorities came to him, said, "We do not want to see this, return to the streets of Paris, and if you don't want to follow Simon de la Cause's path into an insane asylum, it would be best just to go ahead and, repurpose this for another use." So in 1784, William Murdoch, an associate of James Watt, created a more practical version of the steam carriage. Interestingly, Watt pleaded with Murdoch not to pursue development of it, but thankfully, this was advice that Murdoch chose to ignore. Okay, there's 2 reasons that I've come across why would James Watt fight with him about trying to expand the use of the steam carriage. Watt's stated reason is that the the steam carriage was such a preposterous, impossible idea, there was no way it was ever going to be practical. Watt did not want his name or his steam engine associated with this ridiculous idea of a carriage that traveled under its own power, as a steam carriage. But there was another reason. Watt and his partner Murdoch also held the patents to the steam engines. They didn't necessarily want to save it. I think Watt wanted to discourage Murdoch and, then eventually come out with his own. That's just speculation on my part. But anyway, luckily this was advice Murdoch chose to ignore. In another chronicle of early steam-driven vehicles running amok, one evening, while Murdoch was out testing a model of his device, it got away from him on a local road where it approached a local clergyman out for a walk. Seeing this hissing monster, belching steam and flames and moving quickly towards him out of the dark, the terrified cleric took off across a field and into a nearby village where he told those he encountered he had just been accosted by the devil. So, the first steam-powered railway locomotion. Up to this point, it's either been used for pumps or these steam carriages, which were designed to operate on roads. And by the way, the steam carriages, I don't know if you noticed it, they had metal wheels. They were not designed for anything other than a very smooth surface. Oh, okay. This is the evolution of steam-powered engines. Okay, we'll move on here. In 1802, Richard Trevithick, a Cornish miner, early humorist, and pupil of William Murdoch, took out a patent for a high-pressure steam carriage designed for country roads. And again, look at that thing. It's got flat wheels. On one of Trevithick's nocturnal trips around the countryside, he and a companion stopped just short of inadvertently running this particular contraption through a toll barrier. When asked what the toll charge was, the terrified toll collector replied, "There is nothing to pay, my dear Mr. Devil. Do drive on now, as fast as you can." Trevithick is an amazing person. I'd love to do a presentation about him sometime. But I'm sure that this is probably a story that he told to his dying day. So, the locomotion is just the process of moving. It could, so you could have a locomotive that was, I don't know. I guess I think of a locomotive as compared to an engine. A locomotive is much more heavy duty, sort of thing. If anybody else can think of anything better, please jump in. I'm not. That's a good question, and I'm sorry I haven't been asked it yet, so I haven't given it a lot of thought. Trevithick went on to develop a railway locomotive, and in 1804, an unnamed Trevithick locomotive hauled the first steam-powered train on the then horse-powered Penydarren tram road. We're going to talk more about tram roads here in a little bit. While this locomotive performed successfully in hauling 10 tons of iron bar at 5 miles per hour, its severe jerking motion tore up the cast iron track, and it was deemed to be an impractical failure. Trevithick was a guy that was really about 10 to 20 years ahead of his time. At that time, they did not have the infrastructure that was designed to handle as heavy a operation as this. Nonetheless, this is the first operation of a steam-driven locomotive, and Richard Trevithick is now rightly known as the father of the steam locomotive. So, working to make Trevithick's design more practicable, John Blenkinsop of Leeds developed a 5-wheel locomotive in 1811. These were 4 unflanged wheels which supported, you can imagine the 4 wheels at each corner of the car, they supported the weight of the car going over the rail, while there was a fifth wheel that came out from the locomotive. It went along that cogged rail. So this was really an early cog railway where the gear has teeth on it, and it pushes forward and goes along the track, and the cogs keep it in line.
Was there any other development
Oh,
that they had to work with?
well, yeah, you're going to see some other development here in just a moment. So Blenkinsop's locomotive was quickly duplicated. It and similar units were put to work on a 3.5-mile colliery railroad. A colliery is merely a coal processing facility. When you mine coal, you get big chunks, you get little chunks, you get little tiny chunks. And so what you do is you take it to the colliery. They've got a series of screens. They also, when you mine coal, you also get a lot of rock mixed in with the coal. So some of you may have seen some of those photographs of, 8 to 12-year-old boys, children, who would work in these collieries, and they would literally just be picking rocks off the screen as the coal went by. So a colliery is just the main place to process coal. So these Blenkinsop locomotives could haul as many as 30 chaldron wagons. And chaldron wagon is merely a rail car that carries coal at a speed of 3.5 miles per hour. Okay, in 1748, we're going to backtrack a little bit to before we had any steam, transport. The Wylam Wagonway added wooden rails to move coal 5 miles from the Wylam Colliery to Leamington on the River Tyne. In those days, you would process the coal. There was no good way to move the coal except by water, so you either took it to a river or a canal. We'll talk about that a little bit later, too. In 1813, the then owner of the wagonway replaced these wooden rails with this L-shaped rail. So you can see it's L-shaped. And what the rails did, unlike rails now where they operate on top of the rail and they have an inner flange, these actually operated along these rails. And these rails, I say note, these are 3-foot sections of rails with no joint bars connecting the rails. The rails are just put up next to each other. They're drilled into these stone ties, stone blocks, and that was how it ran. So again, these wagonways, these later day rail wagonways, operated on this L-shaped track and pulled by horses. Yes, thank you. No, I'm sure not. I think they probably just used their best judgment when they loaded these. So one of Christopher Blackett's mechanical engineers, Thomas Headley, went on to build a locomotive that would not tear up the newly laid cast iron rails on the Wylam tramway. It was a great idea, but if the steel locomotive tore it up, it was no good. It was no purpose. That's what happened to Richard Trevithick's first locomotive. It was dismantled, and he used the parts to build other things. So the result of Blackett's work was a unit called the Puffing Billy. So following tradition, Puffing Billy was spotted one evening by an unwary traveler who, upon seeing this apparition traveling towards him, leaped a hedge and reported to all he had seen, what? A terrible devil. Word of this encounter quickly spread locally and directed great heaps of ridicule on Blackett's efforts. Poor Blackett, he became the laughingstock of the area around here because everybody knew the story of the Puffing Billy. So, but people got over it, and Blackett persevered. And by 1814, the Puffing Billy and his brother, the Wylam Dilly, shown above, went into regular service hauling coal 5 miles from the Wylam Colliery to the docks at Leamington on the River Tyne. The Wylam Wagonway was the first working railway in the world to use traveling adhesion locomotives. So what a traveling locomotive is, there's two kinds of steam engines. I'm sure there are probably more, but let's just say for our purposes today. One is a stationary engine. You can have a steam engine that will power a cable. And so you can have the railway car attached to the cable. The steam engine will power the cable, drag the cable, and the car will move with it. A traveling locomotive was literally that. It was a self-contained unit. And the power was generated on top of it, and it did not require cogs or cables. And by the way, in case anyone wonders if the British have lost their ability to provide quirky names for locomotives, behold. Oops. Oh, yeah. I give you Thomas, Emily, James, and Toby the Tram Engine. I rest my case.
And there are more.
I realize, yes, quite more. Quite a few more. Let's see here.
Escape.
Yeah, escape, thank you. I'm trying to find I'm using my mouse here, and I'm trying to find the edge of the mouse. There we go. Okay, so we're gonna, this is all leading up to the Stockton and Darlington. We're gonna talk about a tale of two coal fields. The Newcastle and South Durham Coal District. Newcastle District's kind of on the top of this area shown. The South Durham is at the bottom.
So are we in England or France? England.
We're in England, yeah. We're not going to return to France, and I'll have a comment about that towards the end.
I'm glad too.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Jim, would you do me a favor? Would you hand me my iced tea there? I think, yeah, thank you, Susan. Here, I got it. I'm running out of steam myself here. I got to get some. So coal mining in Britain is reported to have begun in Roman times. Due to the proximity of easily mined coal deposits, the first coal deposits were just banks of coal that popped up out of the ground. People come and mine them. Well, they went through that coal pretty quickly. Then they had to start digging for them. And then they got that coal that you could easily dig off the surface. They had to start developing mines. So this particular drawing, this medieval drawing, actually shows that's supposed to be the ground above, and then the coal miner looks like first cousin to one of Snow White's seven dwarfs, toiling away there in the bottom. Anyway, the Newcastle on Tyne area of Britain became known as the epicenter. A famous British saying is carrying coal to Newcastle. There was no reason for you to bring coal into Newcastle. Newcastle already has more coal than they can mine. So by 1338, Newcastle District is reported to have shipped more than 15,000 tons of coal annually, much of it export coal bound for London. Normally when you think of export, you think of stuff going to other countries, but in this area of England, I guess London was far enough away to seem like an exotic place, and so you're going to almost treat it like another country. So they called the coal that wasn't used locally, they called it export coal. So commensurate with mining, the first primitive railway tracks and mine cars appeared in the 16th century. They were little more than logs nailed on logs. So you see the rails, they're logs. They're sitting on logs. There's a switch made out of logs. But they were using these things, made it much easier to move the coal than trying to push a cart over the rocky surface. And of course the rails and the ties, elevated it above the irregular floor surface of the mine. So the interesting thing about this particular drawing is it actually kind of leads up to the flanged wheel. You can see the wheels have these long hubs that come off the wheel. So those hubs actually traveled over the logs. You know, you'd have 2 or 3 guys trying to push it from the rear, and I guess when you came to a switch, you had to stop. You had to lift the logs up, get them lined up, so it could go into a different trim.
Here, and they just moved it over to the left.
Okay.
I mean, maybe.
Okay. Well, that's very possible. I haven't actually seen one of these in operation, but it was not as easy as it is trying to do a switch these days. Yeah. So the first above-ground English coal railways were called Newcastle roads. They weren't even called railways, and they were made entirely of wood, including the rails. These short-haul operations were designed to feed coal to strathers. A strather is a coal discharging platform located on a river or a body of water, in this case on the River Tyne. From here or there, coal would be hand-loaded onto shallow draft keel boats. Now, I'm not going to be giving a quiz on this chart, but this chart just kind of is designed to show all the different wagon ways that existed in the Newcastle area in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, late 1700s, early 1800s. And you can see those the lines that are brown, or the brown lines are the wagon ways. The red dots are the destination or the origin, and the blue area is the water in the area. But it was all these tramways just fed to the water where they could load it on onto the water. There was no attempt to move it outside of move the coal over land any farther than they had to. So thanks to ready access to the River Tyne, coal mining prospered in the Newcastle region. The large coal deposits in the Darlington and Durham area south of Newcastle, however, this is that South Durham area I talked about, these were underdeveloped because of the long distance by road to navigable waterways near Middlesbrough. As one wag noted, no one ever spoke of carrying coal to Stockton for the simple reason it was too expensive to carry it there. In fact, roads were so poor in this part of England that coal was initially carried in large bags laid on the backs of horses because carts got bogged down so easily. And I guess if anybody's ever seen the stereotypical poor old horse that has his spine just kind of curves down, I imagine that's probably what these horses looked like before they were used to pull something other than just have it loaded on their backs. So they set up these private coal roads, and they developed into the first wagon ways. These wagon ways were designed to keep the coal off of roads, so they're not trying to compete with guys, leading flocks of sheep, or wagons or flying coaches or whatever else they might ride. So these first wagon ways were dependent upon both horsepower and wooden rails. This photograph dates, I think, from the 1850s. There were still some of these wagon ways in business then. So you can see these chaldron wagons, and you can see the team of horses up there to pull them. So the entire Tees Valley region of England, which was the area surrounding Stockton and Darlington, suffered economically because of lack of easy access to a waterway. Several canal proposals had been proposed during the previous century, but they did not gain any traction because of the hilly contour of the terrain in the area, as well as difficulty in providing sufficient water to fill the canal beds. Okay, so your eyes are not deceiving you. This is a picture of a bridge with a boat going across the bridge. What is this? This is a canal. This is a very uneven area, lots of hills. So they have to try to make the canal as level as they possibly can. They can't keep it level. They have to start putting in canal locks. So building a canal in this Tees area of England was extremely expensive. The other problem is these canals, they take a lot of water. You're taking the water out of the river, and if you don't have enough, if there's a drought and there's not enough water in the river, the canal dries up, and you're out of business as far as moving anything. We even had that problem in the 21st century with the Panama Canal. Believe it or not, Panama, one of the most heavily rained areas in the world, is having a hard time receiving enough fresh water to restock the Panama Canal. So the initial projected cost for construction of a 30-lot canal from the Auckland coalfield to Stockton came in at £205,283, while the annual projected revenue from the canal was estimated at £8,000. So with a payback period of approximately 25 years, few investors were interested. Frustrated by this, two Durham District coal operators, William Janes and Edward Pease, became convinced the only way to provide a reasonable mode of transport for their coal was through the construction of a railway from the Auckland Valley above Darlington to a pier on the Tees River at Stockton. Pease, a prominent Quaker, brought in several of his co-religionists to help fund the railway, which soon became informally known as the Quaker Line. Pease and Edwards hired George Overton to do an initial survey for a railway line from Shildon, which was in the coal fields, to Stockton. Overton was a knowledgeable early railway builder. He had been the chief engineer of the Merthyr Tramroad, a Welsh tramway, when Richard Trevithick operated his first railway locomotive on it in 1804. This is a great painting of Trevithick actually walking alongside of his locomotive, which is not going very fast at all. If you needed to, you could jump up on the locomotive and work the controls if need be. You could also get away easily if you thought the thing was about to explode, which we'll talk about here a little later. We're coming to that. If Overton had a flaw in his plan, it was his inability to conceive of a wagonway that did not use horses. So, when Overton did his survey of the Stockton and Darlington, he used curves and grades that would have been unsuitable for a traveling locomotive, a locomotive that has to operate under its own power and is probably pretty heavy, has to have an iron boiler on it. But in addition, Overton also made the political error of surveying his railroad through the Earl of Cleveland's fox hunting grounds. So once the initial survey was done for the Stockton and Darlington, Pease and Edwards then had to approach the British Parliament for passage of a bill approving construction of the railway. So this wasn't like the United States. Some of the United States certainly got involved when federal money was involved, but the Congress did not have to approve every railway line built in the early United States. That was not the case in Britain. So during the following 2-year period, Pease and Edward had to deal with numerous lawsuits and complaints brought by competitors and early NIMBYs. If anybody here is not familiar with the NIMBY term, that just means not in my backyard. It wasn't until 1821 Parliament passed the Stockton and Darlington Railway, hereto referred as the S&DR Act, which conveyed the surveyed route from Wilton Collier up in the upper left hand, up where you see Etherley and Bishop Auckland. That's where the mines were. Took it down to Darlington. Once it got to Darlington, it moved on to Stockton. Interesting, the original Stockton and Darlington Railway Act in Parliament defined the operation to be an open-to-all toll railway limited to horse-drawn transportation of coal. It would be like building the North Carolina Railroad and saying to anybody in this room, if you have a railway cart and you got a horse, you can come on down to Burlington, put your horse on the track, and and transport whatever you want to transport, in this case coal, on the railway. So there was no mention of either carrying passengers or even other commodities. It was limited to coal. But these strictures would change. By the way, somebody was saying, why is the horse following the cart? Horse is following the cart because these early railways were designed to take advantage of gravity, especially if the gravity allowed you to carry a heavy load downhill and then take the empty car back up. So the horse was there when you needed him for the loads, but it was definitely needed to return the empties. The father of the railways. So the Wylam Wagway passed in front of a cottage in Wylam, where in 1781 a child was born who would eventually take railways from mine support operations to public thoroughfares. That child, George Stephenson, went to work at an early age in the Wylam colliery, joining his father, who also worked there. Initially illiterate, George taught himself to read at the age of 18. Stephenson proved to be an astute observer of all things mechanical. By the way, when George Stephenson taught himself to read, he could definitely read, but he never really learned to write where anybody could easily understand it. So the rest of his life, he always had to make sure he employed a secretary who would take down everything that he wanted written. He also did not attend any mechanical engineering classes or anything beyond basic mathematics. It is likely that in 1808 he saw Richard Trevithick's Catch Me Who Can, a later locomotive that Trevithick built, when he made a demonstration on the Wylam Wagonway. And that is the Catch Me Who Can. Again, you can see the cogs kind of turning the wheels there. Whoops, what did I? Oh, I'm sorry, I went ahead, sorry. Later, Stephenson hired on to the Killingsworth Colliery, where because of his ability to improve the operation's steam-powered water pumps, it came to the attention of its owner, Lord Ravensworth. It was Lord Ravensworth's support and funding. He took Stephenson, he mentored him, that Stephenson was able to build his first traveling engine, the Blucher. And maybe some of you will recognize this Blucher, maybe not. That is Frau Blucher from Young Frankenstein. Okay, the Blucher was a short-lived experimental locomotive, which initially proved to be less efficient than horse-drawn cars. Why was it less efficient? Because it cost more to operate this locomotive to haul the car than it did to just take a couple of horses and use the horses. It wasn't until Stephenson designed a steam blast pipe which forced the escaping steam into the engine's chimney that increased the ability to increase the overall horsepower of the locomotive. So it increased combustion in both the firebox and boosted horsepower. So based on Stephenson's work on the Killington Railway, he was hired to build an 8-mile coal railway from the Henton Colliery to the River Wear. Over the course of those 8 miles, the Henton Railway successfully traversed over Warden Low. Warden Low is the highest hill in the district. Why you would call it Warden Low, I'm not sure, but that was the name of it. So it starts off on the right-hand side of the above drawing. The railway cars are actually transported up to the top of the Warden Low, lowered down to a conventional steam locomotive. So these are called inclined planes. This particular outfit used both traveling locomotives on the level part, and it used fixed locomotives that hauled cables you would attach the cars to. It would raise and then lower the cables up and down the hill. So they referred to these they were called stationary steam engines, and they had 5 of these inclined planes. And what you would do is while you were lowering the while you were lowering the loaded wagons, you'd use it at the same time to raise the empties. Somewhat like a funicular railway, if anyone has ever seen one of those in Chattanooga, which I know at least one person here has. So, all right, so learning of George Stephenson's work in building this 8-mile Hetton Colliery Railway, Edward Pease invited Stephenson to meet with him on April 19th, 1821. Pease and Stephenson have their first meeting the same day that the first Stockton and Darlington Railway Act was passed in Parliament, although they didn't really learn of the passage of it for several more days. However, when George Stephenson sat down with him, and again, remember George Stephenson, he's a man who works from the gut. You know, he has feelings and he has hunches and he uses that. But he made a number of suggestions to Edward Pease. Based on this initial conversation, Stephenson was soon hired as the chief engineer of the yet-to-be-constructed Stockton and Darlington Railway. Now, with the assistance of his 18-year-old son Robert, George Stephenson, shown on the left below, resurveyed George Overton's initial route and laid out a routing that was not only 3 miles shorter than the original Overton right-of-way, it also provided for gentler curves and less steep gradients. So it was just better overall. Overton was really unhappy that they had taken his survey and had changed it so much. But by making these changes, it made the Stockton and Darlington more amenable to the use of this traveling locomotive. Stephenson also added a 1/2 inch to the planned 4-foot 8-inch track gauge to reduce friction on curves for the interflanged wheels. So this was actually the start of what we now have here in downtown Burlington, 4-foot 8.5 inch gauge on the rails. Now, when Stephenson's making his plans for the Stockton and Darlington, a gentleman named John Birkinshaw took out a patent for malleable, we're going to call it wrought iron railway track. Up to this point, railway track was made with cast iron. I'm not a metalsmith, but my understanding is cast iron can be very brittle. You have to be careful with it. It's easy to break, and when you put a heavy steam locomotive, as we found out with Trevithick, it broke easily. This malleable rail was much stronger. When Stephenson learned of this, he changed his plans and he recommended only the newer wrought iron rail be used on the Stockton and Darlington, even though Stephenson, had recently put in some patents for improving cast iron rail. George Stephenson was willing to ignore his potential money-making cast iron improvements for cast iron rail when he became made aware of the malleable rail. So Edward Pease and Company now had to go back to Parliament for Act 2, which would not only approve construction over the new routing, but also allow for locomotion other than men or horses. This time, with its members now realizing the importance of building railways, it was a much less onerous process getting Parliament's approval. The second Stockton and Darlington Act was signed on May 23rd, 1823. So, constructing the Stockton and Darlington. So the first rails laid on the Stockton and Darlington was laid on May 23rd, 1822. Stephenson had recommended it be built only with the wrought iron rail, but wrought iron rail was maybe twice the price to construct. So what they did was only half of the railroad was built with wrought iron rail. The other half was built with the original cast iron rail that was in use those days. That was what the horses went over, because the Stockton and Darlington was originally designed as 2 motive power type of locomotives. Horse-drawn on the hilly part, or horse or cable-drawn, and then using a traveling locomotive on the more level part. So they used the heavier rail there. In addition to the rail, whether it was cast iron or wrought iron, the track components included both rail chairs, which are rail fasteners as we know them today, or joint bars, and sleepers. Sleepers are nothing but short pieces of railroad tie, if you can think of it like that. In constructing the Stockton and Darlington, thousands of oak sleepers I think we should call them Elon sleepers, but anyway, thousands of oak sleepers were imported from France for the portion of the railway northwest of Darlington up towards the coal mines where the horses were used, while locally produced stone sleepers were used from Darlington to Stockton. These stone sleepers, man, I'm looking forward to seeing these when Pamela and I go to visit. Hello there. When we go to England, I really would like to go here and look at these stone sleepers. But they were literally men chiseling this out of blocks of stone or granite. So they are not easy to transport or lay down. So the unplanned for high cost of this wrought iron rail was a precursor of issues that would plague Stephenson's career. In many of Stephenson's later projects, rail promoters found out the actual cost of building a Stephenson railway was much higher than his initial estimates. And it wasn't that he was trying to rip people off. It was just that he had not been trained as a mechanical engineer. He had very good instincts. He knew how to build a railroad. He just was not good at estimating the cost. In the case of the Stockton and Darlington, he underestimated the cost of the right-of-way, the equipment, the construction of the incline over Brusselton, and the salaries of the employees. So he pretty much got the whole gamut there, I guess. Okay, so these additional cost obligations proved unattainable for the current directors of the board of directors, and they would have had to stop the project. It was Edward Pease, the coal miner, who stepped up to provide the additional funds from his personal assets needed to complete the Stockton and Darlington. In the building of the Stockton and Darlington, some construction had been carried out on property where land ownership had not yet been settled. A July 1823 report to the Stockton and Darlington directors admitted that to date, only 17 of the full 25-mile route had actually been fully and legally purchased. So they'd gone out and basically, constructed a bunch of rail on stuff they really didn't own yet. So you can imagine, that's one of the reasons it took 2 years to build a 25-mile railroad. There was a lot of, consternation about where the railroad was going to go and how much they were going to get reimbursed for it. However, the thing that helped them over the hump was the fact that Parliament had approved it. So commensurate with the start of the construction of the railway, George Stephenson and Edward Pease established the Robert Stephenson and Company locomotive construction facility in Newcastle. By the way, this Robert Stephenson is George Stephenson's brother, not his son, Robert. George Stephenson was very good about bringing his entire family, or at least the male members of his family, in to work for him at his various enterprises. It was in the Robert Stephenson locomotive shops the first 4 Stockton and Darlington steam engines were built. 2 of them are stationary. 2 of them are going to be used to haul coal cars up using a cable. 2 of them are going to be traveling. You hook the locomotive up, it moves with the locomotive. This included locomotion number 1, the locomotive that would later be used for the inaugural run of the Stockton and Darlington. So here it is, locomotion number 1, the first traveling steam engine used on the Stockton and Darlington. Locomotion number 1 was designed to travel up to 6 miles per hour and could pull a 48-ton train at a steady 5 miles per hour. So think back on New Blenkinsop and his 3-mile-an-hour railroad. So this thing not only, pulls the 48 tons, it does it twice as quickly. Also, the first iron railway bridge in the world was Stephenson's structure over the River Gaunnes. Situated between the Etherley Colliery and the Brusselton Incline, Gaunnes Bridge soon proved to be inadequate for use by locomotives. The same thing we've kind of run into the whole time. The locomotives are generally too heavy in a lot of cases for the infrastructure. And so this part of the railway had to be, only the horse-drawn train cars could go over this. Construction of the bridge over the River Skerne was the major accomplishment of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. Originally designed by Stephenson as an iron structure, that first one didn't work out too well. It's probably they didn't go down that path. When the price of iron soared, Ignatius Bonomi, a Durham architect, was hired to build a stone structure. Bonomi had no prior experience in bridge design, and the structure needed to be significantly reinforced 4 years after. Put in service in 1825, today the Skjern Bridge is the oldest railway bridge in continuous use in the world. Okay, the other major accomplishment was the completion of the Brusselton Incline. This is kind of like what George Stephenson did originally. You have a big hill, you have your coal mine, your colliery, your mines are up a hill. This hill stands in the way of getting to Darlington. So what they did was they put in the 2 stationary locomotives on the top of the hill. They haul the loaded wagons up, they lower them down, and meantime they bring the empties the other way. So the engine house up there at the top of Brusselton used the 2 horsepower, 30 horsepower engines from the Robert Stephenson locomotive work to power the 2 rope cables. This facility also had its own small lake to provide water for these engines. These people are doing steam engines. You'd think they'd have an engine that could pump water up to it, but they did. I guess it was easier just to build the lake and let it fill up naturally. So on September 9th, 1825, the Oversight Committee wrote to the Stockton and Darlington shareholders stating the main line will be ready for public traffic by September 26th. Your committee recommends the grand opening of the railway to take place the following day. Means that they were now open to the public, and anybody who wanted to move coal or whatever, they could do it. It wasn't just, they weren't just running test runs with the locomotives. It was open for business, essentially. It had cost £148,000, much higher than the original estimate of £82,000, but the Stockton and Darlington had been completed using some of the best technology of the time and at half the cost of building a canal. So the first run, September 27th, 1825, that's what's going to be celebrated in England next year. When Pamela and I go there, we're not going to be there on September 27th. We'd already been warned there literally can be hundreds of thousands of people traveling to England from all over the world to go there. We thought, there, as you're going to see, there's a number of programs that are going to be on there through the years. So we're going to visit all this before the rush. Oh, but isn't this a magnificent painting, by the way? I love this. You see the people running alongside of it, and the dogs and the stagecoaches, and it's wild. Okay, I'm going to read you a compilation from the official history of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, published in 1875 by Mr. Jones. In 1825, the railway system was not an established fact. Lines of tramway had been opened here and there, and for the convenience of colliery proprietors. But being private property, they were little known and never used by the great mass of people, while horses or stationary engines with cables were the motive power mainly employed. Here, however, was a public railway projected and carried out on a scale of magnitude and novelty not hitherto approached and furnished with the then unfamiliar accessory of steam locomotion. So day 1. The first train had its start at 8 o'clock a.m. We're going back to that little steam house up there with the 2 stationary engines. The proprietors gathered there. They watched the first 6 coal cars being dragged up the top of the mountain and then lowered down. And then they went down, and when these cars got down, George Stephenson was sitting at the throttle of locomotion number 1 with a bunch of other cars waiting there for the coal cars. We're going to look at the consist next. So what was the planned consist of this first train? Now, if you look at this wonderful pencil drawing, you see the train literally goes out of sight, and I don't think this was an exaggeration, because the train consisted of locomotion number 1, the locomotive, a tender with water and coal, 6 wagons loaded with coal and merchandise, the experiment, which was a coach that they had built just for conveying the proprietors, the stockholders of the railroad. There were 6 wagons with seats reserved for strangers, and those are the 6 wagons with the strangers in them here. This is after they've gotten rid of those coal cars. because they're going to get rid of them in Darlington. And so those are the cars with the strangers on there. Isn't that a great idea? Strangers. You're going to go there, you're going to meet strangers. Well, I guess if you go down, ride the train to Charlotte, you're going to probably meet some strangers on that one too. But they definitely practice truth in advertising. There were then 14 wagons for the conveyance of the railroad workers. From the Brusselton Incline, after it left, the train continued to the Mason Arms Public House in nearby Shildon. By this time, they had planned for 300 passengers in the strangers' seats and the workers' seats. By this time, they had doubled that number to 600 people on this train. After departing Shildon, the train took 2 hours, including stops, to complete the 12-mile journey to Darlington. So Darlington is, at this point, is a major commercial hub, and it's the halfway point of the Stockton and Darlington Railway.
And those people paid for that.
No, they did. No, they didn't. These were guests. So they were supposedly invited, but as we saw, a number of other uninvited people decided they wanted to take a ride too. So when the train got into Darlington, dense crowds of people surrounded the locomotive, having never seen anything like it. Remember, people were completely unfamiliar with railways. They were things used in coal mines. People had no idea what they really were, how they worked. So the driver took the opportunity on the gauge cock of the steam locomotive to test the steam. This release of steam had the effect of causing a free-for-all stampede by the onlookers, who were fearful an explosion was imminent. If anybody's ever been to a tourist railroad and you see the steam locomotive will suddenly let out a blast of steam, you will see people, jump. They're not expecting it. Nothing of the kind as far as an explosion happened, and the train soon moved on for the remaining 15 miles, reaching Stockton 3 hours later. So this painting, the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway by the artist John Dobbin, was commissioned 4 years later. It conveys the sense of interest and wonderment the first run over the Skern Bridge generated. Literally thousands of onlookers lined the entire Stockton and Darlington Railroad route between Brusselton Incline, Darlington, and Stockton to watch this tremendous event. You can just barely kind of see the train going across the Skern Bridge there. So after the train left Darlington on the way to Stockton, Stevenson is reported to have taken it up to 15 miles per hour. It took a little over 5 hours to complete the 25-mile journey from Brusselton Incline to Stockton. The arrival of the locomotion in Stockton signaled the arrival of the first commercial steam locomotive-powered railway in the world. Postscript: the Stockton and Darlington from 1825 on. One pleasant surprise for the board of directors was an explosive growth in coal traffic. The original business plan for the railroad was based on the idea that they would mine coal and sell it to the area around Darlington and Stockton. But the real driver of coal traffic came from demand for export coal for London. So this is what really made the Stockton and Darlington such a successful enterprise. As it turns out, the quay in Stockton, or the dock, could not handle the growth in export coal business. So one of the first major expansions of the railroad was opening a line from Stockton to Middlesboro in 1830. Originally just a 40-person hamlet, Middlesboro offered a more expansive harbor with a deeper draft in the River Tees. So it was just a better harbor, a better port.
Because it went by coal. I meant by ship from.
Right, it could go from a larger vessel too. Yeah, thank you. Extending the main line to Middlesboro required additional structures to be built. The first was a 412-foot iron suspension bridge over the River Tees at Stockton, an endeavor that started in 1829, was completed in 1830. Unfortunately, once finished, the bridge displayed a tendency to sway under the weight of a loaded train. You imagine the train's going over and all of a sudden the thing is swaying. It's probably not quite like rocking the baby in the cradle. It's not a probably very good feeling. So this was remedied by the inauguration of horse-drawn four-car trains separated by long chains to distribute the weight. Like the Skern Bridge, eventually they did rebuild it, but they didn't have a lot of luck with their first bridges. Two serious flaws on the early Stockton and Darlington were, first, a total lack of signaling. Okay, so I'm going to draw you to these two gentlemen up here. They have gotten on. They've got their horse. They got their railway cart. They've got coal in it. They're either moving the loaded cars to the river, they're bringing the cars back. Well, they meet. Where are they going to go? Well, they happen to do this at a switch. So they did put in sidings, but there was no rhyme or reason. It wasn't like, traffic coming from heading east had priority over it. There were no humans involved. There was no human daily. There was no referee you could go to. And this led to continuing confrontations involving the various private operators over who had the right-of-way. And I suspect whoever was the brawniest or had the biggest stick or whatever, got to go use his cart first. So regular passenger service began on October 5th, 1827, using a single horse with the experiment coach. This was the coach they talked about. They'd built it for the stockholders on the first train. Initially, there were no stations. Passengers in Darlington were picked up near a road crossing. On Stockton, several stops were made on the docks to board and set off riders. Later in 1825, the Stockton and Darlington undertook a several-year experiment of licensing individual taverns to operate their own horse-drawn rail carriages. As it turned out, tavern keepers operating their own trains eventually proved not to be a well-thought-out idea. In 1833, the Stockton and Darlington bought out the tavern operators, resumed running its own passenger service. Later that year, locomotive-powered passenger trains began running on a regular basis. Isn't this a wonderful drawing of this early train? These guys are having a blast. You can imagine they probably didn't even really need any excuse to travel there, except they're on the tavern-operated thing, and I no doubt the tavern guy has some of his wares on the train to share with them. So,
Were there any shops at all?
any what?
Shops to fix?
Oh yeah, they would have shops. But remember, all these places, these individual things, the Stockton and Darlington, you were responsible for building your own thing. That's a good point. If your coal car broke down, a wheel broke down or whatever, you had to hope another couple of guys would show up and you just push it off to the side and repair it when you could. By 1842, the Stockton and Darlington had expanded its passenger service so much that the original railroad, which on this particular time schedule just runs from Stockton to Darlington, that's the original railroad. Look at how much else has been built into it. It's a huge enterprise by now. And, the traffic this thing carries is, initially carried is insignificant compared to what it carries on this expanded network. So in 1846, the Stockton and Darlington opened a new branch line from Middlesboro to the town of Redcar. To celebrate this event, engine locomotive number 1 was brought out of retirement and pressed into service for the first run. God bless the British. They would save stuff like this, unlike the Americans who would disassemble it or sell it for scrap or whatever. Very few truly early American locomotives were actually saved. The locomotion, and they may have done a little work with it, but it covered the 7.5 miles in a respectable 15 minutes, or approximately 30 miles per hour. So, and we're almost done here. 17 years later, the Northeastern Railway purchased the Stockton and Darlington, and the first commercial railway in the world vanished as an independent entity. So what does it look like in the 21st century? This is the station house in Darlington, which is actually on a main line. Okay, so this particular drawing, the line in black is the original Stockton and Darlington. The lines in red are what's in place today. So there's there's only part of the Stockton and Darlington, basically about 2/3 of the line from Darlington to Stockton is there, and there's some of the line up to Shildon is there. But this are all the red lines are all different railroads. So you can't. It isn't like you can go to England and ride over the original right-of-way. You can't do it except for parts of it. If you're arriving by train in 21st century Stockton, it requires some imagination in order to picture this area 200 years earlier. But as the still in service portion of the Stockton and Darlington bear witness, the Stockton and Darlington Railway retains its status as the forerunner of today's worldwide railway network. I give to you the Skern Bridge in 2022. The original bridge, 1825, still in operation. So, in retrospect, summing up here, compared to the Stephensons' later work in building the Liverpool and Manchester, the Stockton and Darlington was a much easier railroad to build because, first of all, it had greater support from the communities it went through. Secondly, it was easier because it was primarily designed to just carry one commodity, coal. And third, because there were no existing canals, no existing, flying coaches that they were going to compete against, they didn't have any opposition from stagecoach companies and canal boat operators, entities which later came up as things that kind of, made it much harder to build later railways. So, all things must pass. Active up till the end of his life, George Stephenson passed away at his home in Chesterfield, England on August 12, 1848, buried in local Trinity churchyard. Beset by overwork throughout his life and several painful medical conditions towards the close of it, Stephenson's son Robert Stephenson only lived a little over a decade longer than his father did. He passed away in London at the age of 56, October 12th of 1859. Robert Stephenson is buried in Westminster Abbey next to Thomas Telford, a pioneering British road and turnpike builder. The funeral for Robert Stephenson was a tremendous event, even more so because he was a commoner, and the fact he was buried in Westminster Abbey along with Charles Dickens and any number of other famous of Englishmen is a testament to the effect he had. So while neither father nor son, neither George or Robert, ever visited North America, our fledgling network of American railroads were highly dependent on pioneering work established by the Stephensons. While it is safe to assume that railways would have eventually developed without the guidance and foresight of George and Robert Stephenson. Dave, you were asking about the French. The French were actually working on railways during this whole time. It's just that they were months or years behind the English. And of course, they didn't mind coming over to England and kind of pilfering ideas also. So industrial espionage was actually very much a thing in those days. And Robert Stephenson became the son who was the owner of, oversaw the railway works, was furious when he found out that one of his competitors had been taken on a tour of his shop so they could steal all his ideas. So, but anyway, it was without the guidance of Robert Stephenson and George, their accomplishments sped up the introduction of railways into everyday commerce, assured Great Britain's place as the pioneer of world railroading and a leading industrial power of the world well into the 19th century. This is a picture of the Rocket, which is a famous locomotive, which you'll learn all about in the second part of my talk if you ever see it, meeting a modern inner-city British Railway passenger train. See what a difference in the size of these are. Okay, so next year they have SDR 200, a festival celebrating the birth of the modern railway. So it's going to be a 9-month festival taking place in the Durham and the Tees Valley as part of Railway 200. They're going to party for 9 months, yes. That's how they're going to work everybody in, like Pamela and I were going to come, who don't want to come in September. We're going to go a nice part of spring. So it's an international festival. It's going to have a series of free, large-scale outdoor events, new art commissions in public spaces, libraries, and world-class museums in Durham and Tees Valley. Rail enthusiasts and budding historians will be able to hear from experts in their field, and we will delve into the future of travel with our industry partners.